If you've ever knit a top-down sweater, worked in SSK, or knitted from a chart, you have one woman to thank. This is Barbara Walker. And she didn't just influence the world of knitting, she revolutionized it. She popularized the seamless top-down sweater, slip-slip knit, the use of charts in pattern writing, and she documented over 1,000 stitch patterns in groundbreaking encyclopedias that are still used by designers and knitters today. It's nearly impossible to be a modern-day knitter and not have touched a piece of Barbara Walker's legacy. But Barbara didn't stop at knitting. She wrote over a dozen knitting books, but she also wrote over 20 more that reimagined mythology, discussed feminism, and challenged the very foundations of religion. Barbara Walker reshaped not one, but 3 different worlds. This past December, Barbara Walker passed away at the age of 95. This is the story of a woman who changed everything, one stitch, one story, and one idea at a time. Barbara G. Walker was born in 1930 in Philadelphia, and she didn't set out to change the world of knitting. In fact, she gave it a try for the first time while a student at the University of Pennsylvania, and she decided that knitting wasn't for her. She began her career as a newspaper reporter at a time when journalism and newsrooms were really dominated by men. It wasn't until the 1960s that Barbara Walker picked up her needles again, and this time it clicked. She later explained, "Knitting just happened to be one of my winter studies. After marriage, it became my habit to give myself a course each year by collecting all the books in the library on a given subject and taking notes. This method of study isn't surprising given the way that the knitting world worked in the 1960s. Knitting knowledge was generally passed on by word of mouth. There was no Google, no YouTube, no Ravelry to look up instructions and stitch patterns and different construction techniques. You either followed a printed pattern exactly, or you learned techniques from a relative or a local yarn store or a knitting group. Knowledge traveled slowly and often by word of mouth. But by the mid-1960s, Barbara Walker was experimenting with stitches of her own. In 1968, Barbara Walker published a Treasury of Knitting Patterns, and this was the first American stitch dictionary of its kind. Barbara created a compendium where individual stitch patterns were clearly cataloged. She included a clear photo of each stitch pattern along with careful instructions on how to complete it. She followed that first treasury with 3 more in 1970, 1972, and 1992. Between them, she documented over 1,000 stitch patterns, from lace to cables to edgings to reversible stitches. She covers it all. Many of the stitch patterns that Barbara Walker cataloged were traditional motifs that she researched and reinterpreted, but many of them were also wholly original. Barbara Walker empowered knitters. Now, instead of following a pattern from beginning to end, they could mix and match motifs. You want a lace pattern from volume 1 with an edging from volume 4? Go for it. You want to modify a simple vest pattern with cable motifs from volume 2? Be my guest. She enabled knitters to make creative choices in a way that hadn't been normalized in American knitting before. And her books aren't flashy. They have black and white photography with simple instructions, but their functionality has made them a staple on knitting bookshelves for decades. For many knitters, Barbara Walker's treasuries offered something new: an invitation to think critically about their knitting, to deeply understand it inside and out, and to make decisions to suit their preferences, rather than blindly following a pattern from start to finish. And then there were the charts. Now, visual notation for knitting isn't entirely new. Variations on charts had been used in European knitting culture for decades to notate lace and colorwork, but in American pattern writing, it was pretty common to just see long blocks of text. Barbara's third Treasury of Knitting Patterns focused almost entirely on charted knitting. Charted patterns allowed knitters to see how the landscape of their stitches would be playing out over a pattern. It allowed them to predict the flow of stitches and spot mistakes more easily. Charts are a great tool for encouraging knitters to read their knitting and to understand how a stitch pattern is executed. By the 1980s, charts were increasingly common in American lace and cable patterns, and by today they're nearly universal. For many American knitters, this way of working entered the mainstream through Walker's books. In the same year that Barbara Walker published her third Treasury of Knitting Patterns, she also published Knitting from the Top. This book changed how garments were constructed forever, because until then, the most popular method for constructing a sweater was in pieces to be seamed. Front, back, and sleeves were knit in 4 separate pieces, and then you would sew them up to finish constructing the garment. Now, there are a lot of benefits to seamed construction. It gives structure to your garment, but it doesn't offer a whole lot of flexibility to make adjustments as you're knitting. Walker's solution changed that. Knit a sweater seamlessly from the top down, all in one piece, casting on at the neckline, increasing to the underarm, separating for sleeves, continuing down the torso, and finishing the sleeves before calling the sweater a day. This approach to sweater knitting allows knitters to try the garment on as they're knitting. Armholes feeling a little tight? No problem. Rip back a few rows and make an adjustment. Sleeves a little too long? That's an easy fix. Torso feeling a little bit large? You can rip back a little bit and pull it in. Trying on the sweater as you go means adjustments can be made on the fly in a much more simple process than adjusting a seamed sweater. And today, anecdotally, top-down seamless sweater construction seems to be by far the most popular technique to make a sweater. Knitting from the top wasn't just theoretical. It provided instructions, variations, even ways to design your own top-down seamless sweater to make sure it fit exactly your vision. This is yet another example of Barbara really empowering knitters and giving them the tools to make their own creative choices when it came to their knitting. You'll be hard-pressed to find a modern-day knitter who has never completed a slip-slip knit. It's a mirror image decrease for the knit two together, but you might be surprised to find that before Barbara Walker, it wasn't commonly used. In her book, Knitting Without Tears, Elizabeth Zimmerman said, Barbara Walker has, in masterly fashion, transmuted slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over into slip slip knit, which presents an infinitely neater appearance, as well as being easier to execute once you get the hang of it. It's also quicker to work and easier on the tongue and teeth. Today, slip slip knit is everywhere. It feels like it's always been a part of knitting, but in the 1970s, it wasn't. Walker shared the technique openly and it caught on quickly. Over time, it became so standard that many knitters don't realize how recently it entered the mainstream, or that Barbara Walker played a role in getting it there. And then in 1976, she published Mosaic Knitting. Stranded colorwork is famously intimidating to a lot of people. Back then it was too, and Mosaic Knitting presented a solution to that challenge. Walker's system uses slipped stitches, and working in one color at a time created a bold colorwork-looking fabric. In a 2003 Knitty article on Mosaic Knitting, Christy Porter explains, if you can knit simple stripes and slip a stitch, you have all the skills you need. You just have to pay attention. Mosaic Knitting opened the door to knitters who thought colorwork knitting was beyond their skill level. It didn't just expand knitting technique, it expanded who felt welcomed into the world of colorwork knitting. Barbara's books have been widely reprinted. They're still used widely by designers and knitters today. It's not unusual to hear her treasuries referred to as a Bible. Barbara didn't just write about knitting. She built this crafts reference library from the ground up. But Walker didn't revolutionize knitting in isolation. She was part of a small group of American women who reshaped knitting in the mid-20th century, often referred to as the Big Three: Barbara G. Walker, Elizabeth Zimmerman, and Mary Walker Phillips. Elizabeth Zimmerman empowered knitters to trust themselves, questioning traditional garment construction, encouraging seamless sweaters, and popularizing the approach of unventing techniques instead of blindly following patterns. She and Walker corresponded for years. They were famously pen pals, and they shared techniques and ideas with each other. Mary Walker Phillips approached knitting as an art form. Trained in the textile arts, she used knitting to create sculptural and conceptual work, expanding its place in galleries and design spaces. Zimmerman encouraged experimentation. Phillips expanded aesthetic boundaries, and Walker gave knitters the tools to pursue both of those pathways. She focused on structure and documentation to empower knitters to really understand how knitting works. Together, these three shifted knitting from just following instructions to a practice of independence and creativity. While Walker was reshaping the knitting world, she turned her attention to a very different body of work. In the mid-1970s, Walker was serving on a hotline for abused women and pregnant teenage girls. Walker started to notice how many of the problems that were being detailed to her were tied to much larger systems than just one incident. She began to read and then to write. And in the 1970s, she turned her formidable research skills to a very different type of thread: the mythologies, religions, and history that shaped Western civilization. The result was nothing short of monumental. The Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets, published in 1983, spans more than 1,100 pages. The encyclopedia became a cult classic in feminist circles and has been continuously in print since 1983. Walker's thesis is explicit from the very beginning. In her introduction, she states, "Through making God in his own image, man has almost forgotten that woman once made the goddess in hers. This is the deep secret of all mythologies and the fundamental secret of this book." From that starting point, Walker argues that patriarchal religion systematically obscured and displaced earlier women-centered systems of power, and she set out to document what had been forgotten. Walker followed the encyclopedia with the Women's Dictionary of Symbols and Sacred Objects, which took her analysis even further. She combed through global symbology, pointing out where the feminine had been obscured, displaced, or suppressed. From chalices to labyrinths to weaving to lunar calendars, she reconnected symbols to their ancient, often woman-centered roots. And then came the crone, a tribute to the older woman, not as a subject of ridicule or irrelevance, but a symbol of wisdom and power. Walker repositioned the crone as a vital archetype, an elder with authority, not invisibility. Walker's feminist mythology was not universally embraced. Conservative religious audiences rejected its conclusions, and some academic scholars questioned the breadth of its claims and its speculative approach to mythology. Walker was unfazed. She wasn't trying to write history the way it had been accepted. She was trying to ask, what if the version we've been handed is wrong? The books found a lasting audience among feminist scholars, spiritual communities, and individuals seeking alternatives to the traditional religious narratives. Many readers saw her books not just as scholarship, but as roadmaps, showing how history could be retold and how symbols could be reclaimed. Barbara described herself as a skeptical mystic, someone who could see the value in spirituality without ascribing to supernatural claims. To her, the goddess wasn't a deity to worship, it was a symbol to reclaim. Barbara created her own feminist tarot deck filled with original artwork. She painted each card by hand, swapping out traditional patriarchal archetypes with empowering feminine ones. She also created a feminist I Ching, adapting the ancient Chinese oracle to reflect women's lives and values. And she wrote ritual guides. She offered templates for women to gather, reflect, and create their own meaning. Despite all this spiritual symbolism, Walker was a card-carrying skeptic. She joined the Council for Secular Humanism and spoke at humanist conferences across the US. She critiqued organized religion, faith healing, creationism, and New Age pseudoscience. In 1993, she was named Humanist Heroine by the American Humanist Association, alongside thinkers like Margaret Atwood and Gloria Steinem. She walked a fine line, open to myth, closed to dogma, open to ritual, closed to orthodoxy. Barbara Walker's legacy isn't confined to her published books, although they alone would be enough to cement her place in history. Her real legacy is the shift she caused in the way we think about knitting, mythology, feminism. She introduced countless new techniques to the world of knitting, and she categorized information in a way that was accessible and easy to reference. Her feminist works have had a lasting impact. Many see her work as a crucial counterweight to a male-dominated religious history. And she didn't write from an ivory tower. She made scholarship feel personal and accessible. Walker didn't just leave behind books. She left behind tools, knitting techniques that make experimentation possible, mythological frameworks that challenge traditional narratives, patterns of thought that invite autonomy. She was the quiet engine behind some of the most radical shifts in craft and culture in the last 50 years. Barbara Walker gave us permission to question. She gave women tools not only to create, but to interpret, revise, and lead. And her legacy threads through every knitting chart, top-down sweater, and slip knit. For crafters and critical thinkers, her work still whispers, you can shape this, you can understand this, and you can make it your own. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you for joining me to honor her legacy. If her work has touched your life or your needles, I'd love to hear more about it in the comments below. And wherever you are in your making or unmaking, may you carry a little bit of Barbara's boldness with you.